My name is Meagan. I'm the Executive Director of the Wheelock Educational Policy Center here at BU. I come to that work in part as an alumni of the undergraduate teacher education program here at Boston University. Go Terriers. But I also have recently left my role as a state policymaker and very excited about the opportunity to bring research and practice together in this space, and I have been grateful for that opportunity so far. Kate's opening really helped set some context nationally for our conversation for the remainder of the night. And her recommendations are ones that I hope you'll keep in mind as we hear from the next two researchers who've been studying and documenting shifts here in Massachusetts within the teaching workforce over the course of the last 2 years. In a minute, I'll be really excited to introduce you to Dr. Andrew Bacher-Hicks and Olivia Chi, both assistant professors here at Boston University and affiliated faculty with the Policy Center. Both Dr. Bacher-Hicks and Dr. Chi study teacher labor markets and in particular pursue projects that seek to illuminate and understand the educational inequities within our systems. At the outset of the pandemic, anticipating the unprecedented shocks and disruptions that would likely reverberate through the teaching profession, at first what we thought would be in a few months, and now over the course of a few years, they reached out to the State Department of Education in Massachusetts and offered to support the work to better understand the trends that were about to be underway. This past fall, with their work, we were able to tell part of that story, releasing a policy report via the Wheelock Educational Policy Center showing relative stability within the workforce within that first 6 months of the pandemic. And now, with the release of this year's school data, they've been able to update that analysis. And as you will see, there's a different and potentially much more dramatic story unfolding here in Massachusetts. This type of work that Andrew and Olivia will present represents a broader orientation to research we're pursuing here at the Policy Center, which prioritizes working closely with the state and district education leaders to identify and conduct relevant and rigorous research in support of meaningful policy change. Andrew and Olivia will share some of that work happening here in Massachusetts, but this lens is one that we've extended to partnerships in the state of Connecticut, Indiana, and even a subset of districts that sit outside of Boston. Following their research presentation, we'll engage in 2 discussion panels. The first one will focus on the policies and system-level decisions that have influenced the outcomes and could moving forward. And the second will include 4 current Massachusetts Teachers of the Year in order to kind of ground our conversation in what that experience has been like for teachers within the system. Just a quick logistical note, each of those segments will be followed by a short Q&A section. So as you're listening, we hope that you will take note, and prepare any questions that you want to hear from our speakers around. A final logistical note is that in addition to being here in the room, we have a large live stream audience with us. So if you are somebody who's going to engage in a Q&A with us, if you'll wait till one of our students runs over to you with a mic so that everybody both in the room and on our live stream can hear you, we would be grateful for that. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Andrew and Olivia up.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy afternoons to join us today. My name is Olivia Chi. I'm an assistant professor here at BU Wheelock. This is joint work with Andrew Bacher-Hicks, who will be up here in a moment. He's also an assistant professor here at BU. And this is also with Alexis Orellana, who is a postdoc at the Wheelock Educational Policy Center. So we'll be sharing hot off the press work from our project, 2 years later, COVID-19 and the composition of the Massachusetts teacher workforce. So I don't really have to tell the people in this room, COVID-19 has created this unprecedented disruption for school systems, educators, and all the students that they serve. And as mentioned earlier, news stories have really frequently reported these concerns about a mass exodus of teachers. So here are just a couple of examples of headlines from earlier on in the pandemic. A shortage of teachers and COVID-19 create a perfect storm for the education system. That was on CNBC. More than 2,000 Massachusetts educators have received layoff or non-renewal notices. That was in the Boston Globe. Back to school, 1 in 5 teachers are unlikely to return to reopened classrooms this fall, poll says. That was in USA Today. And since then, there have been a number of continued articles reporting a mass exodus of teachers, interviewing individuals who are saying that they're leaving their jobs and not coming back because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And while these are real lived experiences of real people whose stories do matter, it's really difficult to know how representative these stories are of the greater overall workforce. And so with that as some background motivation, we turn to our project. And so what are we doing? We're examining the extent to which the composition of the teacher workforce changed in the state of Massachusetts during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're using state records. We're comparing data from the 2020-21 school year and the 2021-22 school year, so this current one we're in now. We compare data from these 2 pandemic years to pre-pandemic data. We're evaluating patterns in both teacher turnover as well as teacher hiring. So when we refer to teacher turnover, here we'll be talking about spring to fall turnover. So we'll be examining the extent that teachers are leaving their positions during the summer. This is the bulk of teacher turnover, but I just want to mention this doesn't capture within school year turnover. We'll also then be focusing on new teacher hiring. So we'll be focusing on patterns that are occurring in the fall. Again, this doesn't capture hiring that's occurring mid-year. And so what do we know currently about what's going on to the teacher workforce during the pandemic? So early on, 6 months into the pandemic, what we've seen from other states, as well as our own work, is that turnover going into the fall of 2020 didn't seem to be higher than pre-pandemic levels. Looking at literature from Washington State, from North Carolina, among others, there seemed to be an overall picture of relative stability in average turnover across states. However, during that 2020-21 school year, many nationwide surveys also went underway, and that research has shown that teachers' stress levels, as well as their considerations of leaving their jobs, that increased during the pandemic as well, speaking to the difficulty of pandemic-related challenges such as teaching in hybrid mode or sudden shifts in instructional modes. So where does that leave us now? So 18 months into the pandemic, we're now starting to see emerging evidence that's beginning to paint this picture of turnover increases going into the 2021-22 school year. So there's recent data from Washington State that does show an uptick in turnover. And so here's a spoiler alert to the findings that we'll be discussing today, our key findings from this project. So first, teacher turnover, like in many other places, it remained stable 6 months into the pandemic. So going into that first school year that started during the pandemic, going into fall of 2020, that overall statewide picture did look relatively stable. However, going into the fall of 2021, 18 months into the pandemic, we didn't see a mass exodus like many of the news stories reported, but we did see turnover increases of roughly 15 to 20% compared to the pre-pandemic years. These turnover increases that we observe in fall of 2021, they were largest among white teachers and early career teachers. And then when it comes to newly hired teachers, we're finding that during the pandemic, these new hires have been more racially and ethnically diverse than in prior years, particularly among those who are holding emergency teaching licenses. We'll dive into what that means shortly. So taking these findings together, what we're seeing is that these increased turnover among white teachers, in combination with increased hiring of teachers of color, these are just small steps that the state has made towards diversifying the teacher workforce. Okay, so now we'll sort of unpack these results further. So first, we'll be looking at overall turnover patterns at a statewide level in Massachusetts. So here in this first chart, we'll be looking at teacher turnover by school year. I'll sort of dive into what this chart is representing, since many of the charts that follow will look very similar. So first, in these navy blue bars, we'll be representing the share of teachers who are leaving teaching in Massachusetts. And these gray bars will be representing the share of teachers who are transferring to other schools in other districts within Massachusetts. And then finally, in these red bars, we're representing the share of teachers who are transferring to other schools, but within the same district. In total, each of these bars will represent what we're calling total turnover, which is the percent of teachers who are leaving their positions within their schools. So just focusing on 2020, you'll see that the number up here is our total turnover, 14.8%. This means that of the teachers who were present at the end of the school year when the pandemic had started in spring of 2020, 14.8% of them had left their positions in their schools when it came time to start in the fall of 2020. So as you can see, 6 months into the pandemic, total turnover in 2020, it was actually quite similar to the prior years. In the prior years, turnover hovered roughly around 15%, and that was very similar in 6 months into the pandemic. However, when we look 18 months into the pandemic, going into the fall of 2021, we do see an increase. Here, this total turnover rate is 17.5%. It's notably higher than these prior years. And this represents a 17% increase relative to 2019. That's the last year before the pandemic began. And then when we're looking specifically at the percent of teachers who are leaving the state teaching workforce, it went up to 9.4%. This represents a 15% increase compared to 2019, that last year before the pandemic hit. So again, there's no mass exodus here, but it does speak to a real substantive increase going into the fall of 2021. So now on this next graph, we'll be focusing on newly hired teachers. Here, new hires are those who weren't teaching in Massachusetts in the prior year. Many of these teachers are novices. And so for the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that just these numbers overall, these turnover rates, even in pre-pandemic years, is just higher than they are for the overall teacher workforce. You'll see for the overall teacher workforce that I just talked about, it hovers around 15%. Among new hires, even in pre-pandemic years, it hovered around 33%. So just knowing that gives you a sense of baseline that among newly hired teachers, turnover generally is higher. So what we see 6 months into the pandemic, we actually see a slight decrease in total turnover among newly hired teachers. It may speak to this idea that some teachers were sort of hunkering down as there was a lot of uncertainty. However, 18 months into the pandemic, going into the fall of 2021, we do see a real increase in total turnover. It went up to 44.8%. And so this represents a 31% increase compared to 2019 in overall turnover. And then focusing down on the percent who left the state teaching workforce, we see 28% left the state teaching workforce, and that's 42% higher than the 2019 turnover for those who left the state teaching workforce. So again, we do see this real sharp increase in the percent of newly hired teachers who are leaving their positions. And so next on this graph, we'll be representing the share of teachers who leave teaching in Massachusetts, and we look at this by district. So in the previous two graphs, I was showing overall pictures and what it looked like across the state. And that really does hide variation across districts. And so what you'll see in this map, what we do is take the share of teachers who are leaving the state in Massachusetts for a given district, and we shade this map according to that number. So the districts that are shaded in darker blue are those districts with higher rates of teachers leaving teaching in Massachusetts. And so here in this graph, this represents the teacher turnover in 2020. And what you'll see is that 6 months into the pandemic, we actually see that a greater share of districts in Western Massachusetts had high turnover. Though of course, there are districts spread throughout the state that had high turnover, some on the Cape, some spread throughout Eastern Massachusetts. Going into the fall of 2021, 18 months into the pandemic, here you'll see this map, and you'll see that high turnover actually continued to persist in many districts in Western Massachusetts. But high turnover rates also appeared in areas areas around Boston, as well as areas on Cape Cod. And so with that, I'll actually turn over to my colleague, Andrew Bacher-Hicks.
All right, thanks Olivia for getting us started with a great discussion of the overall trends in teacher turnover in Massachusetts. And I'm Andrew Bacher-Hicks, and I'm now excited to dive a little bit deeper into some characteristics that are associated with turnover that provide a little more nuance to that overall picture that Olivia painted. I'll begin with a discussion of differences in turnover by teacher experience. These charts are quite similar to the first two that Olivia presented, where we focus first in the blue bars on overall percentages of teachers who are leaving the state, those who transfer to different districts but remain in the state, and those who transfer to different schools in red but remain in the same district. And what we do differently in this chart is that we separate teachers into four groups. The first group, all the way on the left, includes teachers with 0 to 4 years of teaching experience. The middle group includes teachers with 5 to 9 years of teaching experience. And the group all the way at the end here, teachers with 10 or more years of teaching experience. And so what you can see, if we focus 6 months into the pandemic on the 2020 bar, we notice that there's a decline relative to the pre-pandemic levels for teachers who are early in their career. So there was a decline in teacher turnover 6 months into the pandemic for early career teachers. If we then examine the middle panel, teachers in the middle of their career with 5 to 9 years of experience, the turnover rates were relatively stable. A little bit of a decline, but relatively stable. And then we see sort of the opposite pattern from the early career teachers when we explore turnover rates among the most senior teachers, those with 10 or more years of experience, where turnover actually increased 6 months into the pandemic. So here we can see that there are differential trends in turnover at least 6 months into the pandemic by teachers' level of experience. This might have to do with teacher retirements potentially among the early career teachers, or perhaps the lower health risks among teachers who might be a little bit younger. Then when we turn 18 months into the pandemic, focusing on the 20 to 21 bar, we see that for all groups of teachers, there are increases in turnover relative to the 2019 and 2018 rates of turnover. So in other words, there are increases on the order of about 15 to 20% for all groups of experience relative to the pre-pandemic levels when we're looking 18 months into the pandemic. Now I'll turn to differences in turnover by race and ethnicity. The first thing just to point out, white teachers, all the way here on the end, account for more than 90% of the teachers in the state. And so what you see here among white teachers, where the differences between 2019 and 2020, 6 months into the pandemic, reflect relative stability. This is largely what drives the relative stability that Olivia talked about in the first chart, because white teachers make up by far the largest share of teachers in the state of Massachusetts. And then, just as you saw for the overall turnover trends, there's an increase among white teachers in their turnover rates from 2021 when you compare it relative to 2020 and 2019. However, when you look at all of the other ethno-racial groups presented in this chart, Black teachers, Asian teachers, Hispanic, and Latinx teachers, you see a different pattern. When you look at 2020 compared to 2019, 6 months into the pandemic, you see a decline in turnover for these groups. You do see a relative increase then for all groups looking from 2020 to 2021, but keep in mind that these rates in 2021 are fairly similar to the pre-pandemic rates for all groups other than white teachers. For Black teachers, the difference between the 2019 and 2021 turnover rates, it's about a 5% increase. For Hispanic teachers, also about a 5% increase. And for white teachers, it's almost a 20% increase. So there are big differences by racial, ethno-racial groups looking both 6 months and 18 months into the pandemic. Finally, the last set of charts that explore teacher turnover among various subcategories will now look at different schools categorized by the ethno-racial composition of students in those schools. The first set of bars here, these represent teacher turnover rates in schools where less than half of the students are Black or Hispanic Latinx. The middle panel shows teacher turnover rates in schools where 50 to 74% of the students are Black or Hispanic Latinx. And finally, the last group, schools that have more than 75% students Black or Latinx. And what you can see here, 6 months into the pandemic, turnover increased in the schools that serve the relatively smallest share of Black and Hispanic students, from about 12.4, 12.7, up to 13.7 6 months into the pandemic. And that continued 18 months into the pandemic, up to 15.1% for the total turnover rates. Again, this is different from schools that are serving larger shares of students who are Black and Hispanic. That decreased 6 months into the pandemic in both types of schools that have more than 50% students Black or Hispanic Latinx. And although, again, there were some increases, if you look from 2020 to 2021, those rates still remain below the pre-pandemic levels. So just for example, if you were to compare the turnover rates here, 22.1, that's below the rates that we're seeing in the pre-pandemic, whereas if you compare these schools that have a much smaller share of Black and Hispanic Latinx students, the overall turnover rate in 2021 is above the pre-pandemic rates. And so what this has served to do, you hear a lot about gaps, things that are expanding during the pandemic. This is one gap that actually has not expanded, at least in Massachusetts during the pandemic. So if you, for example, compare turnover rates in 2018, 12.4% of teachers, 12.4% of teachers left their schools, district, or state in 2018 if they were in a school that served less than 50% Black or Hispanic students. It was more than double that in schools that had more than 75% Black or Hispanic students. But that gap narrowed if you compare the 15.1% in 2021 to the 22.1% in 2021. So this is one gap that actually narrowed during the pandemic. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears and talk about the other side of the coin when we think about the factors that could affect the teacher workforce composition. We were talking about turnover before, and now I'm going to talk about characteristics of newly hired teachers. First, I'll begin by presenting just simple demographic, ethnic and racial compositions of students of teachers across time among the group of teachers who are newly hired into the state workforce. Every year, about 9 to 11% of the total workforce is a new hire. We define a new hire as somebody who was not employed as a teacher in the prior school year. And what you can see clear as day in this chart is that by far the largest racial group among newly hired teachers in Massachusetts is white teachers. If we look at the first bar, which represents the school year 2014-2015, about 88% of newly hired teachers are white. In the next school year, about 89% of newly hired teachers were white. But you can see that this share of newly hired teachers who are white steadily decreased over time, and that continued into the 2 years that were affected by the pandemic, the 2020-21 school year and the 2021-22 school year, where about 82% or 83% of teachers hired during those 2 school years were white. There's also an increasing share of teachers then who are hired who are Black or Hispanic, compared to only about 8 to 9% in the earliest years presented in this chart. It's about 14% of newly hired teachers are Black or Hispanic in the 2 years that were affected by the pandemic. Now, if we examine the types of schools that these newly hired teachers enter, we'll see again we use the same categorization that was used in the previous chart where we look at schools with less than half, schools with 50 to 74%, and schools with 75 to 100% of their students who are Black or Hispanic Latinx. And what you'll see is that in this group of schools, almost all of the newly hired teachers are white. About 92% of those newly hired teachers are white, and that has not changed over time. However, in the schools with larger shares of Black or Hispanic Latinx students, you'll see both that overall levels of the percent of new hires who are white are lower, and that there are trends where that share is actually decreasing over time. Finally, we're going to explore differences in newly hired teachers by race, ethnicity, and license type. Now, I've got to provide a little bit of background on this chart. Probably most of you in the room are familiar with traditional licenses, such as initial and provisional teaching licenses. You may not all be familiar with emergency teaching licenses, which began to be offered in 2020 in response to the pandemic. Many teachers were not able to fulfill all of the traditional requirements that you needed to obtain an initial or a provisional license. For example, teachers who were intending to take the MTEL, some of those testing centers were shut down and they may not have been able to actually take the licensure exam. They may not have been able to spend time in classrooms doing student teaching. And so the state offered emergency licenses as a way for teachers or individuals who had a bachelor degree to actually enter the teacher workforce starting in 2020. I'll also mention just at the outset that roughly 18% of newly hired teachers since the fall of 2020 hold emergency licenses. So a substantial share of the newly hired teachers since the pandemic are actually entering the workforce with an emergency license. Now what you can see is that teachers with emergency licenses, those who entered the workforce with an emergency license in both of the school years that are affected by the pandemic, about 70% of them are white, compared to 85% or so of those entering with a provisional license, which was a traditional license that existed before the pandemic, and only 10% are non-white, or 90% are white who enter with an initial license. So pretty substantial differences in the racial composition of teachers who are entering with emergency licenses versus those with traditional licenses. And the last chart I'll show, I'm sorry, I know I've presented a lot of charts in not a lot of time. This is the last one, I promise. But I think it's important to document turnover rates among teachers with different types of licenses, because one concern might be that those who, for example, obtain an initial license, they've completed their teacher education training, they've passed the MTEL, those with provisional licenses have passed the MTEL, and they are both perhaps more committed to the teaching profession, they've invested more time perhaps, they also have arguably received more training, and they've passed licensure exams, whereas emergency licensed teachers have not. And so they might be entering additional challenges when they enter the workforce that might serve to force them out of that profession earlier than teachers who have other credentials. What we see is some evidence of that, although I would argue that it's not as drastic as some may have feared. We do see some differences in turnover rates when you compare teachers with initial licenses to those with provisional or emergency licenses. But when you compare turnover rates of teachers with provisional licenses to those with emergency licenses, they're fairly similar. I think it's too soon to tell whether or not these patterns will hold. Emergency licenses will expire at some point, and those teachers who currently hold emergency licenses will need to somehow convert those licenses to remain an educator. And so I think it'll be important to pay attention to these turnover rates moving forward. But at least for the teachers who were hired in the fall of 2020, looking into their persistence into the fall of 2021, I would say that we don't see drastically different turnover rates by license type. And so that brings me to my only slide that didn't have a chart on it. I love charts, and I don't like text, but I figured that I would try to do my best to summarize all of those charts quickly in just a couple of different bullet points. And so the first bullet point reiterates what Olivia was mentioning in her slides. The overall turnover rates remain stable when you look 6 months into the pandemic. That is, from the spring of 2020 into the fall of 2020, overall teacher turnover rates remain stable and consistent with pre-pandemic years. However, that increased rather sharply in the fall of 2021 after 18 months of the pandemic. And I think this is because we're starting to see the effects of these well-documented challenges of the pandemic on our educators. We've seen, as Olivia mentioned, a number of surveys indicating higher levels of stress. Teachers are reporting higher levels of burnout. And so I think some of those effects are starting to pan out in terms of higher rates of turnover. Now, does this represent the feared mass exodus that you've all read about in just about every news article that discusses teachers? I've also recently been at 2 academic conferences where it seemed to dominate a lot of the conversation about teachers. I think that these increases that we're documenting here probably do not represent the feared mass exodus, but they do represent an uptick that we need to pay attention to. And I'll get back more to this in my very last bullet. The second thing, during the pandemic, we've seen that white teachers leave at higher rates than they did in prior years. The same is not true, at least to the same degree, for Black and Hispanic teachers. And we also see that new hires are continuing to be racially and ethnically more diverse than in prior years. And so overall, this represents small steps towards diversifying the overall teacher workforce. However, I do think we need to take all of this with a grain of salt because we've been focusing on 2 select groups. We've been focusing on teachers who leave and teachers who exit, but there's a large group of teachers in the middle there. And so it takes a lot of sustained movement over many years to actually affect a large change on the overall teacher workforce. So I think this represents small steps towards diversifying the workforce that must continue in future years. And finally, I sort of regret ending on this point because it's a bit of a downer, but early career teachers, when you look to Olivia's second chart, early career teachers were leaving in quite high numbers, especially during the pandemic. So those teachers who were hired in the fall of 2020 left at very high rates by the fall of 2021. If this pattern continues in future years, I think it could pose a threat to the pipeline of teachers as we move forward. And I think we'll really need to think about providing additional resources as policymakers and school leaders that are going to support these new hires in order to build a stable workforce long into the future. And that's it.
So we'll do about 10 minutes of Q&A. And again, if you can make sure that you have the mic before you start asking a question of our faculty, that would be greatly appreciated. And then we'll take a short 5-minute stretch break as we transition into the policy discussion.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really informative. So I have a couple questions because a lot of the way that you presented the data was relative to the timing of various stages of the pandemic. And I was wondering if, so the 2020 data represents, as you framed it, what's happening 6 months into the pandemic. But I was wondering if some of that reflects decisions that were made at the very beginning of the pandemic, like teachers typically renew their contracts, or I guess a question is, do teachers typically renew their contracts in the prior spring? And so that what we're seeing, the data that you're presenting for the fall of 2020 is maybe a little bit more reflective of things that were happening at the very beginning of the pandemic, and where we didn't really think that it was going to be going on 18 months later, so that maybe that's perhaps some of the reason why there wasn't a big change in the first year. And then in the second year, by that logic, everything was kind of a mess. And so in March of 2021, at that point might have reflected if teachers were then making decisions for that coming fall. So just wondering if you could comment a little bit on the timing of of the sort of when teachers make re-up or decide not to for the next year. And then I guess the second part of my question is whether you think, again, like that this sort of jump we saw is in, like, you can't see into the future, but if the pandemic, please, is not going to be like ruling the way that we think about schooling and education forever, that if you expect to see this trend continuing, or if you expect it to be more of like a blip that will then go back to the patterns that we saw before the pandemic.
So speaking to your first point about why we see the information that we're seeing. So just coming directly from the data, we're able to describe the patterns. We don't know the crystal clear the reasons why, but I think just based on what we've seen nationwide, I think a lot of what we've heard kind of, I think, aligns with a lot of what you were saying. That at least 6 months into the pandemic, I think there was still a lot unknown, and there may be this general sense of people were hunkering down, holding on to the positions that they had. People didn't really know what was going to happen, both to the economy, some folks thought the pandemic would be over pretty soon. And so I think it speaks to folks not really sure what necessarily made sense in terms of their next moves. But again, like this, I think corroborates like other existing sources and other pieces of information. It's hard to say directly from our data what drove these exact patterns in Massachusetts, but I think that aligns with a lot of what we've seen more broadly in terms of news coverage in the US and so forth. And I think similarly, the same thing is going on with, there are folks who maybe were in a hunkering down position, and maybe 18 months in the pandemic, they were able to make moves that they weren't able to a year prior. That may have had something to do with the increase, but I also think it speaks more broadly to some of the actual challenges of the pandemic, thinking about the nationwide survey data and the research that's come out of nationwide surveys speaking to increases in stress levels due to having to teach in hybrid mode, increases in stress levels having to suddenly shift modes at the last second. I think that it may also speak to those considerations as well. And then, I'm sorry, what was the second part of the?
The second question, which is, I think, incredibly speculative and hard for me to answer, but is, if we had a crystal ball, what do we think would happen moving forward from here? I don't have a great answer to that question. I do expect that if the situation starts to return to pre-pandemic levels, if levels of teacher stress, indicated levels of job burnout, if all kinds of things like that start to revert back to pre-pandemic levels, I would expect that turnover would also start to move back in that direction, but that's purely speculative, and I love to wait until the data before I say too much more. The only other minor piece that I might add to your very first point about 6 months into the pandemic, the precise way that we calculate turnover rates are sort of looking at teachers who were present in the spring, let's say, of 2020, and then who is not there in the fall of 2020. The same thing for 2021. And so those are going to reflect a wide range of changes that happen over that time period, including not renewing their contract, all of which generally occurred during that period.
And I'll just also add on the speculative piece as well. I think we all hope that some of these that these increases are just blips, and I think a big part of it is also how can policymakers and schools support their teachers, who have undergone yet another challenging school year.
Thank you. This is really fascinating data, and I'm curious. Anecdotally, I hear from teachers all the time, both through work and in my personal life, that this current year was the hardest year of their career. Not last year, not 2020 spring. And two questions, I guess, that are related. One is, I know you can't speculate, but I am curious if you're intending to continue this study and capture the data of what's happening with this new year, and if there are any plans to add some new, new nuances to the data, for example, looking at what types of schools we're seeing more or less turnover, let's say traditional public versus charter schools, or is that happening equally at different levels? Because I think in addition to the pandemic, I think we'd all agree this has also been a socio-political, very tumultuous time that has had an immense impact on teaching, but perhaps not equally to teachers in all settings.
Yeah, I think That's a great point. I plan on studying issues like this for the rest of my career, and so whether or not I'm digging into these specific data sets or in other data sets, I will absolutely be tracking teacher turnover patterns for many years to come, especially during this year. And so absolutely that's a focus. And to your other point about looking into other cuts of the data, we've done some of that. We weren't able to present everything that we've done today, but we will be releasing a full report that's actually going to have more detail in it than what we've been able to get through today. So I would say look for that. It will have some of the things that you brought up and might not have everything, but if you reach out, we can also talk about potential other cuts, and we can add that into future analysis because I agree, there's a lot of important nuance that gets lost, which is why we tried to cover some of those today, but obviously not all of them.
And I'll also say stay tuned. We're actually continuing work in partnership with Massachusetts where we're doing a much deeper dive into emergency licenses and how turnovers is sort of panning out among groups who are pursuing the emergency license and to what degree are they able to convert their licenses. And so I would say stay tuned for that as well. I'm sort of on the same boat as Andrew. We'll continue doing this work as long as we're allowed to continue doing this work. So.
Thank you so much for this. It's really, really interesting to see how these patterns are playing out. One thing I'm really curious about is I think we have some suggestive evidence from prior studies that higher rates of attrition in schools serving predominantly children of color and higher rates of attrition among teachers of color in the past have been due to involuntary turnover or higher rates of involuntary turnover among those teachers, more likely to be evaluated in biased ways, more likely to receive RIF notices, and so on. So I'm curious if you're able to unpack the extent to which these changes in the patterns of a turnover are driven by differences in who is experiencing involuntary turnover. Perhaps schools are hesitant to let folks go in a time of shortages. I don't know if you've had a chance to unpack voluntary versus involuntary turnover and how that might play into those changing patterns.
So to my knowledge, I actually don't think we have as detailed data as to be able to unpack that currently in terms of what we have. I think that a lot of that can be done sort of at the district level among folks at individual districts. I don't think that's as fine-grained as we're currently able to unpack, but those are really great ideas that we wish that we could push further. But at the moment, I don't think we're able.
Hi, good evening. I want to say thanks again for such great data. One question that I had, you had put up two charts, the 2020 teacher turnover by school district and then for the next year. And you noticed the pattern of Western Mass, there was a concentration of teachers leaving, and then that next year it was Western Mass, the Cape, and then surrounding Boston areas. But then when you go to the newly hired slide, there was definitely an increase in diverse teachers in schools that were 75 to 100%, students of color. Is there any correlation between those areas? Like, are there a greater concentration of those diverse schools that are hiring those in those particular areas? Or I'm just wondering, is there a connection there? Is that where those schools are located? Are those schools located in other places? Is it like a swap, meaning that those teachers are leaving and then we're, hiring more diverse teachers, or are they going in other places?
Well, we saw that there was an increase in diversity in both the 2020 year and in the 2021 year. I think we'd have to look at the correlation that you're talking about to know for sure. We haven't done that. But there was an increase in diversity of new hires in both of the school years. And so even if you look at the maps that we showed earlier where there are sort of differences by district, and I think that some of what you're getting at is probably true, that some areas where there were higher turnover in 2021 are districts that have a higher percentage of students of Black and Hispanic students. I think still we're seeing higher shares of newly hired teachers of color in both years. Are we out of time? Okay. Thank you all.